willing to do that. If you haven't done it yet, particularly, but if you've done it once during the series, it would be willing to do it again. This sign-up list is going to be on the back center table there, and we urge you to sign up. Okay?
Test, test. Good.
We were told not to turn yours on.
Oh, that's right.
Hello. I used to do sign language, but I had to quit because I stuttered too bad.
That is not politically correct.
Okay, all right then.
Yeah.
Okay, I assume everybody has outlined Untroubled in Paradise. If you don't, raise your hand. I'll see that you get one. Everybody okay? All right, looks like our hand-outers did a great job. I will tell you in advance, this is one of the hardest presentations for us to make, but you're going to find it to be extremely informative. It comes from 35 scientific journals as we deal with an industry that is estimated at $97 billion a year. The internet is the crack cocaine of what's going on. The internet has provided the base for a lot of pornography for a number of reasons. Number one, it's private, it's portable, it's 24/7, it's basically free. As we talked with an individual, they said that, they're just 2 clicks away from basically a fix. One of the things that we always say at the very beginning, anyone can be addicted, okay? Why? Because we're human individuals. And so we're going to work a big puzzle tonight, and there's going to be a number of pieces that hopefully you will understand with that puzzle. Let's begin then tonight quickly with our definition. Our definition is sex used or depicted in any way that distorts God's intent. It encourages selfishness, not selflessness. It's based upon lust and not love, and uses others whether real or imagined. As we talk about sex tonight, we're talking about sex in general, not talking about the sex act itself. We're talking about a lot of material that's out there. Some of it's written, some of it's visual, some of it's verbal. Your entertainment industry, your romance novels, some of your soap operas, and even some of your music. So this comes down the pike in a number of different ways. It's there. So that's the definition we'll be working with. And again, that's the reason why the Sunday morning sermon we did several weeks ago, the foundation for it was the idea of the servant heart. Because that sermon then penetrates everything basically that we do throughout these Wednesday nights. So get your teeth around this. Sex used or depicted in any way that distorts God's intent. It encourages, it manifests, it promotes selfishness, not selflessness, based upon lust and not love, and uses others where real or imagined. This is a very pervasive industry. It is estimated then that $3,000 a second is spent on some kind of pornography. You find all kinds of statistics to how true they are, how accurate they are. I don't know, but this is what we have found. We have found that 64% of Christian men at least look at pornography at least once a month, and 15% then of women. We've also found that before the age 12, 28% of the men have been introduced to pornography and 11% of the women. So this is really not just only an adult problem, but this actually arises many times in preteen or teen years. So again, we're dealing with a very difficult problem, and it's there, and it has escalated. As I indicated before, we did not deal with this issue when we first started this ministry, but we then had about 10 minutes into it, and now it's, of course, evolved into what you're actually hearing tonight.
All right, let's talk just a little bit about the addictive nature first. Keep in mind that we are beginning with all addictions in general, and then we're going to narrow to sexual addiction specifically, and then narrow even more to the sexual addiction of pornography. There are many sexual addictions, but we're centering on pornography. All addictions, and I don't care if you're talking to gaming, to shopping, to eating, to recreating, to porn, to work, recreate, it doesn't matter. All addictive behavior is formed in an effort to fill an emotional void or to mask an emotional or physical pain. Now, that's succinctly put, but that's the reality of it. Also, any substance and any behavior can become addictive. There's nothing that is exempt, simply because as human beings, we're fragile. We've talked about this before in various ways. Remember, we talked about, a few weeks ago, that if I'm out here millennials ago and I run into a woolly mammoth, I don't have to ask my body what it wants to do, right? It's fight or flee or I would faint, more likely than not. Okay, and so when the body, it's wired into us, survival. Because if I didn't do that, if you didn't do that as a human being, we would die, and we all did that, the species would die. And so it is hardwired into us. That's when we hit something in life, an emotion or an experience that makes us feel unsafe, it's that simple, then we're going to try to get back to equilibrium, to feel safe. Well, the mind is the same way. Physically, if I hit something, I'm going to try to take care of it. Mentally, again, like I just said, if I have an experience or experience an emotion that makes me feel threatened, that for whatever reason, I don't have the tools to work with, I don't know what to do, the mind will do exactly what the body will do. It will fight it or it will run from it. And specifically, what you have with addictive behavior is probably a combination of both. You're fighting it by running. In other words, we're trying to get away with it. Away from it. The reason all addictions really are epidemic now, I think we've run through this in another session somewhere, maybe it was another class, is simply because never in the history of our culture has there been a time where getting a fix of anything was so easy. We now have a smorgasbord of ways to self-medicate. I don't care if it's work, I don't care if it's electronics, I don't care if it's entertainment, I don't care if it's food or whatever. We're not on a farm some 200-300 years ago. Right? Hard work, early bed, no. If we hit something we don't feel safe, then our society of comfort gives us a variety of ways to kill it. Therefore, huge epidemics. And human beings, like I just said, are designed to survive.
It's going to be an important piece of this puzzle is to understand what we call the addictive cycle. Now, again, we're talking about addictions in general right now. Pornography we'll get to in a more specific way later on. First of all, we need to understand what's called the triggers. Is triggered then is by physical pain or threatened feelings. We're talking about abandonment, we're talking about rejection, failure, boredom, stress, anxiety, criticism, isolation, anything. If you cannot identify the trigger or the triggers, then you're going to have a hard time dealing with any kind of addiction. So understanding how it came about is very important. Secondly, then, we understand it's fueled then by reward dependence and novelty seeking. If you remember the first presentation we made several weeks ago from Cloninger about the domains of temperament and how people are formed, one of them then we dealt with novelty seeking. In other words, the thrill seeking situation. And so what happens many times that people go into an addiction of some kind, especially drugs or otherwise, or other drug or close to that, they would come into it as a thrill. You know, it's the conquering, it's the idea, it's a novelty and so on. So it's a dare you to do this or something like that. So you need to understand then what triggers it and then how then it is fueled. Now we move on then to what we call the signs of an addiction. The question is, when does a behavior cross the line and become a full-fledged addiction? When does that happen or take place? Well, let's give you some standards whereby you can measure this. Number one, An addiction is present, or a substance or behavior is present, if it's continually then used to escape mental or physical pain. In other words, if you want to, it's going to alleviate how you think or how you act or something like that, it can be an addiction there. Then, if it's used in a repetitive or unmanageable way, in other words, it's out of control. People say, well, I can control this. Well, again, can you or can you not really actually control this? And then this one also, it has led to or will lead to destructive consequences. In other words, you can get in trouble with the community, in trouble with the law, trouble with your family, all kinds of trouble. So here again, these are the questions that you need to ask yourself about whether or not there is a substance or presence there. Now, another way to figure this thing out is, does this individual or his closest friend, or do your closest friends think that you have an addiction? See, sometimes you're so close to this thing you don't even see it at all. So what will your closest friends then say about this? Does this actually exist? Number one, do you have to lie to cover up your behavior? Do you have to tell an untruth? If you have a gambling addiction, do you have to tell an untruth that I didn't do that, or whatever it might be? So do you have to lie to cover up your behavior? Secondly, are you putting yourself or others at risk, either physically, mentally, or spiritually, or even financially? Here's where the gambling addiction would be in, because you could put your whole family and everybody around you, of course, obviously your family, would be at risk. The third would be, are you called upon to violate one's value system? Now, this is the tricky question of the three, because that's assuming that your value system is correct. What happens many times, a person's value system is so warped and out of shape that they can do certain things and still feel good about it. Why? Because their basic value system is out of whack. Now, you don't have to answer yes to all three of these questions for then basically be an addiction available. Now, the classifications of the addictions. Classifications actually fall under two categories, that is minor and major. But they're both addictions. Now, the minor ones are a little bit easier to work with because with using a little behavior modification, we'll talk about in just a minute, you could get out of it. Some of the examples would be working, shopping, screen time, computer time, recreation. In other words, you could become addicted and you just can't live without it. You need to then identify the triggers that send you that way. That's why I said before about the triggers are very important, because if you can't figure out why you're doing this behavior, then you're not going to be successful in getting through it. There could be a trigger or triggers. Now, how would you get out of this? You would then begin to modify your thoughts and behavior. Let's say you have a shopping addiction. And ladies, you might have more problem with this than the men, but of course both can have this. And you just want to, go and you've had a bad day, kids have been bad, television doesn't work, and you want some kind of, excitement. So I'm going to go to the mall and buy something.
It's retail therapy.
Retail therapy, yeah, but retail therapy can get pretty expensive too.
It can.
All right. So you get there and you buy, something you don't need, and finally get home, you feel bad about it. What you can do is modifying your behavior. You can say, okay, I'm going to go to the mall for 30 minutes or an hour or whatever it is, and this is what I'm going to buy and do. So in other words, you can get out a lot of this by modifying then your thoughts and behavior. Those are minor ones, even though they can be destructive, can be dealt with. Now, the major ones then are a little bit different deal. These are harder to break out of. Okay, let's take all substance. We're talking about drugs and alcohol. What you have to deal with is, the withdrawal that it creates, and at times then to get back in some kind of semblance of some kind. And so the withdrawal and the recovery then sometimes is real long for either substance addictions. We're dealing with alcohol or drugs. Gambling addiction. This is an interesting one. In other words, you have to deal with not only what you didn't make, but what you actually lost. And so but now the problem is there's an intermittent, many times, reinforcement. You spin the wheel just right time, or you buy the car at the right time, and you get this and that, and so you go buy something else. And so that can be very dangerous. This is very dangerous because and we talked about this, I believe, the last time, or at least mentioned it, you can lose your whole inheritance in just a matter of a short time. And so it can become a very, very dangerous addiction to break out of. Sexual addiction, of what pornography is just one of them, and we'll deal more with this and how we recognize this and how we work with this. It's very important that in any addictions you have, is that your moral compass is intact. If you don't have a good, solid moral compass and good, solid Christian values and so on, then you're going to have a hard time with most of these situations.
Okay, this is hard, isn't it? It is. Let's talk about the significance of an addiction, specifically as it works itself with other people. Any type of an addiction can destroy relationships and or interfere with life functioning, simply because the addiction becomes the mistress of the marriage. And finally, the third point, self is a supreme object of service. Now, I want you just to back off just a minute and think about that. Through the years, we've worked with lots of people in sexual addictions, but we've also worked with lots of people that have put their families at risk and their relationships because of the hours spent either gaming, computer games, watching television, recreating, working, whatever it would be. Whatever the reason, the individual is engaging in that. In a very real way, they have mortgaged their relationships because self is a supreme object of service. That's what an addiction says. It has to be maintained so this individual that is engaging in whatever it would be feels safe for a little bit, feels stable. They're running away from whatever is threatening. And because their stability, we're hardwired to survive, that's paramount. If the people I love or don't like this or at risk, too bad if they're collateral damage. You see how this is working here? It's all back to anthropology and our own survival. I like to say that in order to truly live a Christian life, we have to center on something that can trump our survival ethic. And that sounds really strange, but that's the truth. Because human beings left to their own devices will survive. And it doesn't matter if it's addictive behavior, if it's hurting other people, it doesn't matter. And so in order to really, to trump that, it's that strong, to trump that survival ethic, there has to be something stronger. And that, in my opinion, is living for something stronger than me, bigger than us, bigger than you. Okay. Now, let's put that to bed and let's go over here and grab another piece to this puzzle. We're not doing the edges first and then we're just going everywhere. All right, believe it or not, we've tried to fine tune this and it's just flat hard. Let's talk about the sex drive. And you're saying, well, I had biology, I've had kids, I don't want to talk about that. Well, I know. So let's review a little bit about what we learned in biology, but then maybe introduce us all to some things that perhaps we did not learn in high school or junior high biology. What we did learn is that sex is an automatic response to erotic cues, period. It's an SR chain, stimulus response. And again, we're back to anthropology. We have many of those. A baby is born with SR chain. If you come up behind an infant and you make a loud noise, the startle reflex, correct? Absolutely. If you have a glaucoma test, they put that puff of air in your eye, you're going to blink. SR chain. It's linked to survival. You don't think about it. You don't necessarily want to do that. It's just going to happen. Carry it to its end conclusion in this presentation. If an individual is presented with erotic material because we are hardwired to survive in every way, it will produce sexual arousal. It's that SR chain. It's not good, it's not bad, it is necessary for the human race. Okay, now, we learned that, but what we might not have learned, at least I didn't, is that every emotion enhances the passion level, the sexual passion level. As far as science knows at this point, this is what separates sex in the rest of the animal world and in human beings. In the rest of the animal kingdom, it is literally about hookup. It's hooking up. It is a hormonal response for preservation of the species. That's it. But as human beings, we're created very differently in a lot of ways, and this is one way. We have emotions with everything we do. We cannot divorce ourselves from who we are and the way we're put together. And every human emotion enhances that sexual passion level. But look at the next slide, or the next phrase, and the practical implications. The negative emotions create a higher passion level than the positive emotions can ever create. Now, chew on that mentally for just a moment, and let's move it into the real world. Okay, let's take, a man and his wife, the conjugal relationship. One of them sends an erotic cue to the other, and it can involve any one of the five senses, individually specific, and it is. All right. Now, because it's that SR chain, erotic material, sexual arousal, there will be sexual arousal in that spouse. Now, at this level right here, I'm going to call that just the pig, cow, dog. I mean, that's the lowest, that's what that basically is, okay, right there. But emotions are tied to that, right? And so what you do is you add all the emotions in that marriage, hopefully the good emotions, the love, the trust, the faith, the good memories, all the things that have made this marriage what it is, hopefully. And so what you're going to end up with is a passion level here, right? Instead of a pig, cow, dog, just a response. Because you've got the emotions. But what does it say? The negative emotions create a higher passion level than the positive emotions can ever create. Let's talk about rape, shall we? Rape is not a sexual problem. It is a life problem that is acted out in the sexual arena. That's what it is. Why? Because you have an individual that is sexually aroused for whatever reason, and you add to that, in a rape situation, a lot of negative stuff. Hate, frustration, rage, terror. It could be a lot of things, fear. And so what happens? You end up with a passion level way up here instead of even what would be down here in the conjugal relationship, you see? And ultimately, that's acted out against another human being in what is really a horrible, horrible violation of both people, the rapist as well as the victim of that. Now, this is why sex in a premarital affair, a premarital relationship, or an affair situation is so powerful. I want you to think about that a minute. Those of you that have worked in the trenches with people, and maybe you've had, I don't know, whatever, but people, I'm sure you've heard, we've been around the block at all, people talk about how good sex is before marriage, if they're engaging in that, or if there is an affair. Because I don't know how many times we've heard it, and we'll go through some of this in the affair proofing session. It's so much. It's the good sex, the good sex. But what makes it so good? Well, there are several things, and we're going to touch on a lot of them. One of the things is the negative emotions, depending upon the moral compass of that individual. The fear of getting caught, the guilt, the anxiety that now maybe I'll have a disease, or I've impregnated somebody, or I'm pregnant. And so you see what happens when it's not in a marriage situation. You have all this negative emotional energy that is filtering down to this erotic arousal, this sexual arousal right here. And so that's where it's coming from, among other things. You let that couple get married and you tap into their sex life 2, 3, 6, 10 years down the way. I'm not saying it's bad, but it's different for all kinds of reasons. One, it can't be that same passion level. We talked about some of that last week, but it's legal now. If we get pregnant, okay, we'll deal with it. There's no fear. I don't have to lie, don't have to sneak around, don't have to deceive anybody, no guilt. It's all legal now. And same thing with an affair situation. We see this over and over and over again. People dissolve a marriage because they didn't think the sex was what they wanted. And so instead of doing all the stuff that should have been done, and we talked about that some last week, they have an affair and they think, oh, it's so good over here, I can't live without this. So they divorce this person, marry this person, and what's going to happen? It's going to go down too. And it's going to continue that same destructive cycle. And so this is a very interesting, a very important piece to the puzzle. Okay, now then, let's get down and talk about correlations. Oh, sorry, I forgot about that, didn't I? That's what I get when I don't look at my notes. All right. Where are we?
Correlations with sexual addictions.
Okay, yeah, I'm all right. Okay, you've got the genetic, pardon me. I just, sometimes it floats around, but it lands usually. Okay. We're also coming back to Cloninger's work. Again, we can't get away from that stuff either. Because if an individual has a genetic dependency, or a genetic tendency for reward dependency, they're at higher risk for addictive behavior. And if they have a genetic tendency for thrill or novelty seeking. This may be why you have 3 children, you rear them all the same way. One ends up to be a full-blown addict of some sort, and I'm not deterministic. We have choices. There are a lot of things that work into that. But like we said when we did that I believe it was Please Listen to Me 1, we're all playing this game called life with different cards. And what might be a temptation and a tendency for one child might not be for another, just because of the genetic predisposition. Okay, now, it's you now.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, we're going to talk about some levels of sexual addiction. Some of the books that we're going to recommend at the close of this particular presentation are going to talk about the levels within the levels. But basically what you have on sexual addiction, you have basically 3 levels. Keep in mind, again, the definition that we're using. Sex depicted or used in any way that distorts God's intent or purposes. It encourages or promotes selfishness, not selflessness, and it's based upon lust and not love, and uses others for real or imagined. That's the definition we continue to use. All right, basically the 3 major levels. Number 1 would be the habitual use of pornography in some form. This might be a magazine, it might be a video, it might be a book, it might be a novel, it might be TV or whatever it might be, but it's some form that you would actually see and engage in. Level 2 involves then a real person, maybe computer-generated images, phone sex, strip clubs, prostitution. In other words, it's gone from a fantasy or something in the mind that you would have to actually a real live, real person. The third, of course, is the serious one, also too very serious, is obviously the criminal activity. Lynn talked about rape. We talk about pedophiles. So what you have are these three basic deals. So when you're dealing with sexual addictions, it's either the use of it in magazines, so on. Secondly, it involves a real person, in which you've gone, and then criminal activity. So you depend on what levels, and we'll talk about dealing with this problem later on and some of the suggestions we would give.
All right, we got out of sync. You want to put your glasses on, I think. Okay, I've got to back up. Scott, there we are.
Yeah.
Okay, this is where I those first points I didn't make.
Well, you gave it to me, so I took off.
Well, no, never mind. All right. Okay, now, sometimes people ask, what causes sexual addiction? Well, I think if we could really answer that, we could retire the national debt, right? You can't do that. In science, you never say causality. You know, we've talked about that. The best you can possibly do is correlation. Correlation. That's it. Okay, now, I've already given you those bottom two, but let me spend a little bit of time on numbers 1, 2, and 3. And they're on your outline. If you go back up, you'll see B, 1, 2, 3, and okay. There is a correlation with the research that they come from unmet emotional needs from youth, the failure to develop specific constructive coping skills, and the fear of emotional intimacy in adulthood. Now, let me kind of unpack that. Again, get your mental teeth on that, into that, and let's work with it. Emotional needs, that sounds so vague, and it sounds so weird, and it means a lot of things to people, and that's okay. But what this is really referencing is in the family of origin, and again, no one died and made me boss. You heard us last week on anybody's parenting. We do the best we can. You know, if you think we're here to victimize anybody because of parenting, you're at the wrong place. Because Jerry and I do not work in victimization. We just don't. That's a dead-end street. Well, for whatever reason, the parents were missing in action emotionally. And maybe it was because of mental health issues, physical health issues. Maybe they were working 5 jobs to put food on the table. Maybe there were 10 kids. I don't know. It doesn't matter. It just is what it is. And for whatever reason, the child or children were not taught the tools they needed to work with the negative experiences and emotions in life. Silence is a huge word in a family of dysfunction. Silence. Usually in the regular seminar format, conference format, this session will follow Parenting 101 by a couple of days. And so they've had time to digest some of the things that we're going to introduce to you a couple of weeks from now. But there are 4 horsemen of dysfunction, and all families have them to some extent. But one of the things, the signs, is the parents don't talk. They just don't talk about negative emotions or negative experiences. Okay. When there is silence in the family, the child grows into adulthood assuming that everyone else knows how to work with these things, but I don't. Don't be selfish. Don't be angry. Don't get your feelings hurt. Don't. Okay, fine, but I'm 5 years old. How do I work with anger? What am I supposed to do? You tell me I can't hit my brother with a truck. But I'm angry, so what do I do? Well, most of the time, if parents don't teach children, it's because they don't have the skills. That's what I said last week. We build on what we know and then go from there, helping the next generation. There is a high correlation between shame and sexual addiction. Now, that doesn't mean everybody that had shame or silence in their families is not at all. What did I tell you? Cloninger has a lot to do with that. Right choices have a lot to do with that. Moral compass has a lot to do with that. Again, this is not deterministic at all. But shame, keep in mind there's a very definitive chasm between shame and guilt. And don't forget this. Shame says, I am a mistake. I'm a mistake. Guilt says, I made a mistake. Do you see the difference? Shame says, I am a mistake. Guilt says, I made a mistake. And so when the parents are missing in action emotionally as far as helping children navigate the negatives in life, missing in action emotionally, they grow into adulthood, assuming, and here comes number 3, the fear of emotional intimacy in adulthood. Because evidently everybody else knows how to work with all this stuff, because I was told don't do this, like I should have known what to do, and I'm less than because of this. And so there's a lot of shame in me. And so in adulthood, it is much easier to engage in solo sex. Aren't you glad you came tonight? That's the correct political term. Solo sex, than it is to be emotionally vulnerable and physically vulnerable with a spouse. You see that correlation there? Because if you knew who I was, if you knew how lacking I was, how deficient I was, because everybody else evidently knows this and I don't, you wouldn't like me and you wouldn't love me. And so I retreat into a world of where I feel safe, where I feel like I have some control, although it's false. Okay, and then the genetic things that we already talked about. Okay.
Okay, well, I've already talked to you about the 3 levels,
Yeah.
and here again, it's very important. There are levels between levels, and so there's all kinds of this. But basically, it's the 3. That is, first of all, the visual, then a person's involved, and then finally, criminal activity. Moving on.
Moving on, let's talk about defining factors. Sometimes someone will come and they'll say, I'm married to a sex addict, and I say, that's a pretty hard accusation. Why do you say that? Well, he or she wants sex 5 times a day. That's a sex addict. Maybe. Maybe it's just someone with a pretty high libido. I don't know. Okay, this is information that somehow we've overlooked. And it certainly hasn't been taught. It is not the frequency of a sex act. I don't care if it's solo sex. I don't care if it's sex with a spouse. I don't care if it's with somebody, a hookup. I don't care what kind you're talking about. It is not the frequency, but why it occurs. But the why. It's not the amount, it's the why. Okay, look at this, and before everyone hyperventilates here, okay, there are levels of sexual addiction. And we have a whole section, actually 2 sections on our additional resources list. They are by recovering sex addicts, their spouses, all evangelical, and they will delve into some of this in more detail than we have time to tonight. But technically, a sex addict clinically, and again, levels, or whatever you want to do. Okay, number 1, it is used to escape mental or physical pain. We've already given that one a pass, right? We agree. Number 2, it is not an expression of emotional intimacy between 2 people. And number 3, it can lead to or has led to destructive consequences. Okay, technically, that is the clinical definition of a sex addict. That's it. And again, it gets really complicated, but that's the way it is. Okay, now let's move on and let's talk about the chemical addiction. We had, I believe, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, we were doing a series on Sunday morning about different things, and some of this information, I work with pornography, I believe, that Sunday morning, and some of this information that I'm going to present right now was in that particular presentation. So hopefully this will be just a refresher for some of you. Others of you, it may be new information, but whatever. Okay, food and sex target dopamine. And this is the pleasure chemical of the brain, or it activates, this is a chemical that activates the pleasure centers of the brain. Okay, and it thrives on novelty, shock, surprise, and novelty. Okay, now let's just leave that on the screen for just a minute and let's back up. Within our brains, like I just said, there is a reward center. And the reward center lets us know, it is activated by chemicals, dopamine, basically, the norepinephrine one, there are others, but basically we're working with dopamine. The pleasure chemical activates the reward center to let us know whether or not what we're engaging in is pleasurable. Because of anthropology, when an individual is either eating food that sustains life, not carrots and lettuce and cauliflower. You know, nobody sells that in fast food, nobody. Okay, but when an individual is eating food that really has the potential to sustain life, you're talking about your carbohydrates go to sugar, right? Your sugars, that's all energy. You're talking proteins, you're talking your fats, because that's that anthropology, because that is going to sustain my life longer. If I don't know when I'm going to eat again or whatever, that's what I want. And so when the human being is engaged with eating foods that sustain life or in sex, there is a big hit of dopamine, a big hit. Some of the scientific journals and articles that we ran across compare it to a shot of heroin. It can be that strong. I didn't say always, but again, the research in that is very variable. Now, how do you know whether or not you like to play golf, watch television, play a game, or read a novel? Well, there's something that is rewarding. Something in that is triggering a reward center in your brain. But this is the kicker. Most of the activities that we engage in have an off switch. I love chocolate, but there comes a point when I've had enough. You may like fried chicken, I don't know, but there's a point. You may love to shop, but there's a point when you're going home, you've had enough. I don't care if you're watching television, I don't care if you're reading, I don't care if you're working, it doesn't matter. There's an off switch. Yeah, this was pleasurable, but now I've had enough. Even food has an off switch, like I just said. But the interesting thing about sex is that it doesn't have an off switch.
Now that's very important. Listen.
The sex drive does not have an off switch. It doesn't. And so what has happened is that courtesy basically of the internet, I already indicated that pornography and sex can release, it releases dopamine, all right, that's definitely a reward there. But with the internet, dopamine thrives on what? Shock, surprise, novelty. Follow with me. What's happening courtesy of the internet? A punch of a button and it's a new shock. More erotica. Haven't seen that. Haven't done that. Haven't been there. And so what happens is you keep having these bursts of dopamine that are hitting the reward centers of the brain, so much so that the brain fights back. It wasn't created for that overload. And so what happens is the receptor cells of the dopamine that are trying to send it to the reward centers, they shut down, and the reward pathways shut down. And so the person has more or less become used to, they become tolerant of that particular level. It works the same with any drug. It's the same thing, the same idea. But this has no off switch, remember? And courtesy of the internet, the individual has habituated to this level, but now in order to I missed my buzz, I missed my high. And so I've got to get more shock, surprise, and novelty. And when I engage in that, then new reward pathways are established. Dopamine is then released. And so you see, it is a never-ending cycle. It goes up and up and up and up. It finally gets to the point, finally, where the body just is totally overloaded. One of our favorite websites on this particular, on pornography, is the one that is not Christian in orientation. All the others are, but it's the one we recommend first, simply because if you're working with someone that doesn't have a moral compass, it's the only chance you have. And it's on page, I don't know, Jerry will find it in a minute, but it's, the title of it is yourbrainonporn.com. It's on page 3, halfway down, yourbrainonporn.com, like the 4th website. But let me tell you in just a nutshell why we recommend this first. This was not started by religious men. These were men in their 20s and their 30s that had grown up in the Garden of Eden of what they thought was internet porn. And assuming that you know, that once they got married or whatever and had all the sex they could want, then they wouldn't need this anymore. But the bottom line is shock, surprise, novelty. Shock, surprise, novelty. And so it's going, it's all different. It's all different. It's all different. Constant, constant, constant. What happened, these guys get married and then they find that they cannot relate to their wives sexually in their 20s without some kind of chemical help. How embarrassing for a young man, how emasculating. But see, what had happened was, this is the same person. One of the most interesting pieces of research, and it's all over, TED Talks has it, it's everywhere, is that you can take a bull and you can put him in a pen with 2 cows in heat, and he'll breed them, he will. But you put him in a pen with 7 cows in heat, and he will breed until he dies or passes out. And you say, well, what? That's really weird. Why? It's a different cow. It's a different cow. And see, this is what happens with an individual that does the porn for shock, surprise, and novelty, because with a spouse, it's the same cow. Or the same, and that sounds degrading, I don't mean it that way, but it's the same, it's the same. Do you understand? There's absolutely no way that a spouse can compare with the shock, surprise, novelty, and that huge burst of dopamine that is coming off of the internet. It's apples and oranges. They're eons apart. Okay.
What about the girls?
What? No, go ahead. We're running short on time.
All right, let's go to another big piece of this thing, and I know this is difficult to listen to, but I think because really you don't have a baseline to understand this in several ways. Let's talk about habituation. We mentioned it before in a previous presentation. Let's go back and visit again. Habituation simply means we become used to the sight, sound, and stimuli that's rough around about us. You have habituated to these shoes on your feet. You have habituated to the clothes on your back. In other words, you're not wearing them unless they're too tight or something. You buy a piece of furniture and you bring it home and you sit there and stare at it. Now you don't pay any attention to it. So, in other words, you have basically habituated to it. Habituation is not wrong within itself. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is habituation is a natural human phenomena that you'd have to engage in. Now, let's do the sexual implications of this. Okay, the young couple gets married. The foreplay is new, the act itself is new, the nudity is new. That's just the way to strike up the band, bells and whistles, birds singing, and so on. All right, go on down to year 5, year 10, or whatever it is, and it's quite different. Why? Because you have habituated to one another. And again, I'm not saying that's wrong, it's just a natural human phenomenon, whereas the foreplay is not new, the act itself is not new, the nudity is not new. We're not saying bad. That's not what we're saying at all. But you basically then have habituated with it. What happens then, more times than, well, at least the experience in our counseling and our work, it's the man who says, this is not, like it used to be and so on. So what does he do? He goes then to the world of porn. Come back to what Lynn is saying on the shock, novelty, and surprise, folks. This is crucial. This is crucial. So what does he do then when he goes into the world of pornography? Shock, surprise, and novelty. Well, he gets this picture. Well, then what's another picture? Then what's another picture? And a different picture, and all kinds of things. In other words, it's not one thing. And many times what we have found, I mean, said, well, I got into this thing and I was not going to get out of it, or I wasn't going to do it anymore, and then all of a sudden they're doing it again. Why? Shock, surprise, and novelty. It's there, and it feeds the whole thing. Then, more time, it gives him a high and a buzz that he hasn't had in a long time. Again, that dopamine that Lynn has talked about. So what does he do? He introduces it into the marriage. Well, what does it do for a period of time in the marriage? It gives them a high and excitement that they haven't had. Why? I haven't seen that, haven't done that, haven't experienced that. In other words, habituation has not clicked in yet. All right, after a while, habituation clicks in. And it gets more and more and more. More times than not, what we have found in our work, it's the wife that says, hey, let's put a stop on this thing. And this is going further than I thought it was going to go. He plays the guilt card and says, well, if you don't do this with me and so on, then I'll get somebody else to be your fault. What they thought then was actually going to encourage the marriage and help the marriage just really actually became an extremely destructive situation. Now, question, what does it do then, effects on the marriage? We've already indicated then that it affects the emotional intimacy of the marriage.
Wait a minute. No. Yeah, you got your glasses on.
Yeah. These the images then are imprinted on the brain, and they're basically then forever.
This is on the individual.
This is on the individual. In other words, that's why we tell our young people when we have a chance today that there's some doors better left closed, because once they're open, you can never ever close them again. Hopefully with good determination and good Christian counseling, you can then work around them. Next, it encourages in the use and abuse then of other people. You see, if I'm hooked on pornography, then you ought to be able to control what you do, how you do it, when you do it, what you wear, what you say, what you don't say. So then it becomes very destructive in that area.
Next, erotica is linked to violence. This is classical conditioning. We don't have time to walk through that, but most of you probably remember a little bit of that from somewhere. It's back to that SR chain and a neutral stimulus hooked to that original stimulus. Okay, at the most elementary level, pornography uses other people, right? It does. But it doesn't take long into that journey, specifically of internet porn, where now the erotica, which is going to create sexual arousal, we already talked about that, is linked now to someone being hurt. Maybe someone is slapped around a bit, abused, forced to do something. What are we looking at? Shock, surprise, and novelty, right? To get the same buzz. And so what's happening in the individual's brain, and they don't even know it, the erotica is being linked to violence and abusive behavior. After not that many linkings, you can take away the erotica, and the abuse by itself is sexually stimulating to the perpetrator. Again, we're back to rape to some extent. Well, in a very practical level, it is just tragic, the number of spousal and child abuse cases that take place every day in our country, hundreds and thousands of them, that are linked to sexual stimulation of the perpetrator, especially when coupled with substance and alcohol abuse. Other people, whether real or imagined, are not objects to be used or abused. It flies in the face of who we are. It flies in the face of the servant heart.
Now let's talk about what it does to the marriage. First of all, it affects emotional intimacy. In other words, when a person is involved in pornography or of this kind, here again, it takes to download the time takes it away from the marriage, the time to come down from it, and again, the intimacy is very strongly affected. Then, as we've already emphasized, is it encourages disrespect and control of children and spouse. When we find control issues then in any kind of marriage or family, that could be attributed to a number of things, but pornography then obviously is one of them. So it can be very destructive then as far as the marriage is concerned.
Point C is really hard, but we've put it in our presentation because we kept running into it working with couples, and we finally had to give this idea a voice. A spouse is too often used as a chemical fix. Now let me explain how that plays out, at least in what we have learned. Let's say you have an individual making a male, although it could be a female, but let's say a male, that becomes hooked on pornography as his main coping mechanism in his teen years. And he's a good person. He has a great heart, but he doesn't like this, but he doesn't know how to work with all these threatening emotions and experience. So he assumes after he gets married and has all the sex he can want, then he won't do this anymore. Well, he gets married and he does relate to his wife, but occasionally, more often than he wishes, he would still dip back into that world of pornography and the solo sex thing. Okay, let's say that he works on a project and he works 6 months and he's so proud of it, and he goes in and he hands it to his boss, and his boss just thumbs through it and he slams it on the desk and he says, "This is unacceptable. You start at square one, do it again." Huge rejection. Huge. But he never learned how to work with rejection. No one ever taught him. And so he doesn't, so what does he do? That night, instead of doing the solo sex thing and the porn thing, what does he do? He comes home and forces and guilts his spouse into having sex. Do you see what's happening? He's using her body as a chemical fix. And technically, that would be a sex addict. Why? Simply because it is used to numb or escape feelings, right? He's trying to get away from the rejection. It is not an expression of emotional intimacy. He doesn't care what kind of day she's had, what the kids have, he doesn't care about any of that. It's all about him and needing this dopamine. And I guarantee you it's going to lead to destructive consequences because she's going to resent it. Because she'll see that she's nothing more than an object that is being used. And so you see, we make the statement that spouses can really rape spouses. They wouldn't think they were, but if you look at it, they really are. Because instead of that beautiful experience that we discussed last week, it's all about the individual. Self is a supreme object of service. And finally, the fantasy world becomes the wrong world, and the right world, and the real world becomes the wrong world. We each establish our own perception of reality, correct? And the longer that an individual lives in the fantasy world, the more that becomes the world it should be. And therefore, if my sexual fantasy is someone that has needs other than mine, they're selfish. And if my sexual fantasy gets turned on by all the erotic, kinky things that I might want to do, if my real spouse will not engage in that, they're cold or frigid. And if my sexual fantasy is some pumped up male or some airbrush filled up female, then my real spouse is too fat, too flat, or too old. And I look at my spouse who's really a good person, but because I've got it all upside down now, I look and I think or I say, "What's wrong with you? How disgusting you are." So you see, ladies and gentlemen, maybe no smoking gun, but the victims are just everywhere.
Breaking out of the bondage, we're going to have to cut this a little bit short. The goal is to learn to address in a productive manner the feelings and emotions that trigger the addictive cycle. Some of these books that we're talking about recommending, and there's places, we'll maybe mention about Bethesda, is the place that we have recommended. Quickly, we can just add some things here. First of all, you're going to have to decide that it's wrong. You say, well, no, it's just what good old boys do. I beg your pardon, not good old boys in the Lordship of Christ. You tell me what you read, what you look at, and what you listen to, and I'll tell you what you are. It's garbage in, garbage out. You accept responsibility. What's the first step in any 12-step program? You accept responsibility. I'm a drug addict. I'm an alcoholic, or whatever it might be. Don't blame your spouse. Don't blame your family. Don't blame your family of origin. Don't blame your people at work. You accept responsibility. Finally, then pray. In order to be engaged in sexual morality or any kind of morality, pornography, you're going to have to factor God out of the equation. And it's very important. Prayer is very important here. Next, take action. Look at some of the possible resources. Turn to your additional resource list, please, and go to page 3. Page 3, we have listed there the books and also some of the websites that we would recommend. Lynn, you want to say something about that?
Okay. All right. You want to give them that last one?
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And then I'll
Okay.
do that.
Then you need to change your focus. In other words, you can't get out of this unless your focus has changed. Where you're focusing on and so on. As long as you don't change your focus, you're in deep trouble.
And finally,
Then
become accountable.
become accountable. In other words, you're not going to get out of this thing by yourself.
Okay. Now, we have not reinvented the wheel tonight, simply because, as Jerry said, this information came from a lot of different scientific journal articles. Nothing that you can't look up for yourself and fact check us however you want to do that. Go for it. But what we have not done is dwelled on the breaking out of bondage, because all these books do this and these programs do this. We tried to save you lots of hours from reading and looking up stuff. That's what we were about tonight. But then what we've listed, this is not inclusive, but it's a jumping off place. All right, certainly I would suggest you would start with Patrick Carnes' Out of the Shadows. It's your first book under pornography. On page 3, you see 2 headings, pornography and for sex addicts and their spouses below that. Patrick Carnes was the first evangelical that came out of the shadows of sexual addiction in the 1970s. This was his first book, the flagship book. But since then, he's updated it. He's written many others. Don't Call It Love, Recovery for Sexual Addiction. You can go on down. You can't go wrong with any of these. You will see by women, by men, and then the programs below that. We highly recommend BethesdaWorkshops.org. It's the very bottom of page 3. It was founded by a member of our fellowship, by the way, that as a young woman flew out of formation sexually, any way you want to imagine. She's now a grandmother. She came out of that, has now established this. It's an in-house thing that runs from about 3 days to a week. It is for couples, it's for individuals, but it is incredible because she makes individuals go back and identify the triggers and starts helping them with the skills they need to handle the triggers. When I feel abandoned, when I feel rejected, when I feel like a failure, I handle it this way. Yes, I'm an adult, but I can relearn some things. And that's what she's all about. You cannot get out of any addiction unless you address the trigger. You can, but it's an excellent program. Okay, go back up then to the websites that are under pornography. When we first started a segment on pornography, it was like, 5-10 minutes long. It was probably 25 years ago, I don't know, whatever. But obviously it's now grown, so we can't even really get it into an hour and do it justice. We used to say put a blocker on anything that can access the internet. Forget that, any 6-year-old can get around a blocker. I can't. And then we said, okay, get a filter. Well, a filter, any 12-year-old can get around. I can't, but they can. And then a filtered server, well, that won't let you go places where you legitimately need to go. Forget about all that. And by the way, we don't get a kickback on any of this, okay? Just in case you're wondering, we're plugging other people's good stuff. All right. Instead of that, we recommend online accountability programs. The first, let's see, the first 3 websites under pornography, they're in blue there, or you'll see them as websites, Accountable to You, Triple X Church, Covenant Eyes. These are online accountability programs. They're PC, Mac compatible, they're Android, iPhone, whatever, it doesn't matter. iPad, it goes across the board, tablets, whatever. When you actually enroll with one of these programs, you sign up with 1 or 2 accountability partners. It's either a text message or an email address. And the minute that particular device hits something that is questionable with the text message, I believe it is Covenant Eyes that does the email thing still, but the other 2 do not. It's text, and there are others as well. But nevertheless, it's an immediate text message to your accountability partner. In other words, you're booked. It doesn't matter what you know about cookies or history or racing. You can't do it. We have programs listed for children. It is just so sad that our kids are growing up in a world when they can be doing research for some kind of a school project and run across some of this stuff. And be informed, stay in tune with your kids and what they're doing. We have Stephen Arterburn has programs, Every Man's Battle, Every Young Man's Battle, Every Woman's Battle, Every Young Woman's Battle. Our heart cries for these people because we've run into so many of them with broken lives and broken marriages, and they're trying so desperately, and so many of them have been successful. But the desire has to be there. Honestly, if there's a man, no offense to anybody, but there's a man that's younger than 50 that tells me he's never been tempted, I didn't say he used it, but tempted to look at porn, I just ask him what else he lies about. I mean, I do, because it's everywhere. This stuff does not stop because it's not our problem and because it's embarrassing to us and we don't understand it and our kids and grandkids wouldn't do it anyway, so let's just no. This stuff only stops when we love each other enough to grab each other's hands and say, this is every woman's battle, because it is. This is every man's battle, because it is. And we will stand in the gap with each other and for each other, and we will fight this together. We have so many people across the United States that have come out of this stuff, not because of us, but because of their determination and God's love and their hard work. But they have begged us, please, if you run into anybody that just needs someone as a prayer warrior, someone to walk with them, give them our contact info, because we'll be there. If we can be of service to you, you know us, you know, but church leaders, and if you don't want to come to anyone that you know, that's fine too. But there's so many resources here, and again, it's not inclusive, but these are good. It's a good place to start. Bottom line is, don't let this cost you your family or your soul, your eternity. Thanks.
Next week, we're talking about loving your mate through seasons of life, and we're going to talk about how you take inventory. We're going to be dealing with depression also next week, if I'm not mistaken.
Self-esteem.
Self-esteem, depression. Be sure to bring your additional resource list, because we're going to talk about some more books. You're visiting with us tonight. Thank you for coming. Good night and God bless.
I'm sorry you're tardy tonight. Apologize to the childcare people.
If you brought kids, you got to take them home.
Tell them it's our fault.
We're not keeping them any longer.
Our fault.